Why is change so hard, slow, and minimal for so many of us? Our beliefs, our frame of life, this is our comfort zone. And we don't like leaving our comfort zone. We don't challenge our context, which is our beliefs. We tend to literally stay consistent with that belief even when given contradictory evidence, even if it's factual and verifiable. Whatever we think we believe, that is our context, and that is the foundation of our reality. The truth is this: it's easy to change when you actually engage and work with your brain in the way that it's designed to operate. The three general ways to change a specific context or general context is You're listening to the Transform Your Life from the Inside Out podcast. This episode is titled, Why Change is Often Hard, Slow, and Minimal. Given that headline, Why Change is Often Hard, Slow, and Minimal, I know that you're listening because you want to create some level of change in life. What I've also observed out of many of you and interacting with you in different ways and doing this for many years, and even looking in my own life, is that oftentimes when we want change, it's many times hard, slow, and minimal. In this episode, I'm going to talk about why that happens and how to get around that. So if you'd like to speed up change and make it a whole lot easier, keep listening. Okay, so why I'm laughing. Why is change so hard, slow, and minimal for so many of us? Now, I don't know about you, but I can totally relate to that at different points in my life, how change was just hard for me. And it was for many years until I learned what I'm going to share with you in this particular episode. And part of what inspired the episode was all of my work with Don Javier, the shaman, for 28 years. And I know that if you listen for any amount of time, you get tired of hearing the shaman. But you know what? We have new people listening all the time, and they don't know that. That's why I do it. I mean, I'm kind of in a rock, between a rock and a hard place, trying to actually not wear that out with people that have been around forever, but also letting people that are new and joining us kind of get up to speed a little bit. So this was inspired by working with him for so many years, and in my own life, creating so much change, but watching many people work with him. Right now, there's probably, I don't know the exact number, 12, 15, 18 people that work with him to the extent or the level that I do. And there's only 6 of us that still work with him that have worked with him for 28 years. And I see various levels of change. And even like 2 or 3 years ago, and he never mentions anyone by name, but he was talking about particular behaviors. And there was someone that works with him, and I was guessing who it was, that just keeps going back in the same behaviors over and over and over and over again, even though they're not helpful behaviors. And so that inspired this episode because I look at people who listen to the podcast, and I'm grateful for that. And I notice that people fall into one of 4 categories when it comes to listeners. The first category is the person who listens forever. They will tell you they've listened, since 2018, and they've listened to all 361 episodes. And many people have even said they've listened to them many times. But you know what? They still don't do a whole lot. And I've had people listen for 4 years before they're like, Jim, I'm ready to take my first step doing something with you. And I've said, why? What's taking you so long? And come to find out, the predominant theme, despite me saying it for many times, is that they are working from circumstance. They are working from time, energy, and money. So the reason, number one, that change is slow or minimal for a lot of people is they're working from circumstance, time, energy, and money. Number 2 is a belief. I've heard this one before. A couple of years ago, and I'm going to do 4 or 5 next month or so, but a couple of years ago, when I was promoting TCP, the Transformational Coaching Program, I did approximately 8 interviews with former TCP students. And I asked every one of them, was, could you have gotten the transformation you got with me in TCP from the podcast only? And they all unequivocally said no. But the second belief that I hear a lot of is, oh, I get everything that I need from the podcast. Well, what you're doing, there's an overriding belief there. And that belief, number one, without knowing what's in TCP, the Transformational Coaching Program, is a false belief because you think that I'm giving you guys everything here, which I don't, which is why I also started the Secret Podcast. But the belief is I'm doing okay. That's the predominant belief. I'm doing okay with what I have. And then you dig deeper, and the predominant belief is, are you okay doing just okay? Are you doing okay making just enough to where you're kind of comfortable? Or what about if you had a belief where I don't just do okay, I bring extreme abundance into my life? Two very, very different contexts. I'll talk about context in just a moment. Two very different beliefs. Another one is this. I've changed a lot by listening to the podcast, and I just need to take time and let it all soak in. Well, notice that belief is based upon the concept of time. And that's what I want to talk about in this episode. Is many times we think that it takes a certain amount of time to change, which is partially why it makes it hard. Because if we are hardwired and we've learned that we want things fast, anything that takes time, we're not going to do. And especially when it comes to changing our behaviors, if we can't do it immediately and it takes time, no way, no how, we're not going to do it. And then the fourth category, which is the smallest percentage of listeners, is, okay, I got a lot from the podcast and I know there's even more and I can dig deeper. And you know what, Jim? I want to work with you in the Transformational Coaching Program. When the doors open, when can I register? So I see these beliefs. These are the four prevalent beliefs, but all of these beliefs are built on a person's context. Now, context is literally the context from which you think. Context is the frame from which you think. Ponder that. Your frame of thinking. So your frame of thinking will determine how you approach this podcast, but the frame will also determine how you do every other thing in your life. Everything you approach in life, you will approach with that same context. Now, I mentioned the word context, and you probably have heard me, maybe you've heard me say this before. Context, content. I just did a program last week on about not setting goals and shifting your context. And I used this book as an example, Think and Grow Rich. This was written, I don't know, probably 100 years ago. I've heard it sold 100 million copies. Well, the truth is, statistically, only like 2% of people who've read that book have become rich if they weren't rich prior to reading it. But what about the other 98%? The problem is they couldn't get the content from this book into their context, meaning their frame of thinking. I fought that battle for decades myself, growing up poor, Texas farm boy. I read a lot of material, tons of books about becoming wealthy, independent, self-employed, all these kinds of things, but I could never get the content to stick in my context. So I want to talk about the context of beliefs, context of change, and the proper context that you want to start creating to make change a whole lot easier. The challenge also with context is context, whatever it is simply made up in your mind. And it can be your ticket to, metaphorically, the moon, or for most of us, it is your glass ceiling, meaning analytically, you're sitting here thinking, okay, Jim, I listen because I want more in life. I want to be more. I want to do more. I want to have more. Now, I don't know when you're listening to this episode, but in March of 2025, we're going to be delivering live again for the first time in a year, the Be, Do, Have series. It'll be a 3-part live series that I'll be delivering. But we all want to be, do, and have more. So we listen, we gather content, which is external information, but we can't get that in our context. Again, second time I'm going to say it. Later in this episode, I will talk about shifting context. Whatever beliefs you have about your context, they're invisible. They're the glass ceiling. We don't know that every single time, meaning most people don't know, and I'm sharing it with you now, every single time we hit a glass ceiling, we're stuck. We don't recognize that's because of our context. So what we do is we fight that glass ceiling, not recognizing that it's really about shifting the context that created that glass ceiling. A friend of mine, he's a very big internet marketer, very successful guy. He and I were chatting one day, and out of the blue, he goes, I can have anything that I want in life when I have the proper context. And I heard that probably 20 years ago, and it made an impression back then because I work from that very same place. I can have anything I want in life when I have the proper context, not content that I'm listening to and stuffing my head with, but the context to put that content into. It's like a frame. So the context is the frame of my thinking about what I can be, do, and have. But for me to be, do, and have more, it's not about reading more. It's not about me listening to more podcast episodes. It's not about me listening to other podcasts. It's not about me gathering more content. It's about me shifting the context that I'm putting all that content in. Meaning it's about shifting the subconscious frame that I'm putting this new information into. And if my subconscious context, my frame, my beliefs are like, you can never be rich, it doesn't matter how much content I put in my head about being rich, it will never happen. Why do we not leave our context? Why is it so hard? And why do we stay in our context? Because our context, meaning our beliefs, our frame of life, this is our comfort zone. And we don't like leaving our comfort zone. And I know you've heard me talk about this before if you've listened for any amount of time. And some of you might even be rolling your eyes going, okay, oh, brother, here we go again. He's talking about this again. I am talking about it again. And the reason why is, for whatever reason, this is so challenging for a lot of people to integrate into their lives. And unfortunately, there are not a lot of people who share what I'm sharing with you and teach this. You'll hear very few people, if like really any, talking about content versus context when it comes to personal development. So that's why I'm repetitive about it. But also, even if you've heard it before, I know, because we're all the same, we can hear something one time and not have the context to assimilate it. And maybe you heard me say this 9 months, a year ago, and you've shifted your beliefs and your context. So now when I say it again, you hear it in a different way. You can't assimilate it where a year ago you could not assimilate it at a subconscious level. One of my coaches used to say, and I don't know why he picked the mayonnaise jar, but he used to say, if I put you in a mayonnaise jar, and again, I have no idea why he had mentioned the mayonnaise jar. And he said, if I put you in a mayonnaise jar and I told you to get out of the jar, but the label is on the outside, the only way to read the label to get out of the mayonnaise jar is to get out of the jar to read the label. And the same thing with your context is the context, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Your context is going to keep you trapped. Now, I want to talk about social context, and I want to talk about personal context. We learn our personal context from socialization. Anatole France once said, now what he said is just because 50 million people believe something, that does not mean it's true. And the way that I'm going to tweak that a little bit is because 50 million people say something, it doesn't mean that it's true because 50 million people say something. But what we do is we hear all these people blabbering about A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I'll give you some real life examples. We hear people blabbering about this stuff, talking about it, social media. We don't ever fact check. We don't ever critically think about it. We accept it and it becomes part of our context, true or not factually, but it becomes true for us. Guys, I cannot stress enough, I am not partisan in the US. I am not a Democrat. I am not a Republican. If I were anything related to an affiliate or affiliation with the party, it'd be libertarian. Basically telling the government, keep your hands out of my pocket and leave me alone. We have heavy lines divided in the United States right now, and it's all because of context. But let's look at, and honestly, I'm sure there are examples on the other side of the aisle. There's no question about it. I just writing this episode or thinking about this episode, I didn't have time to do a lot of research to find, because this can take a long time to do, at least for me. I didn't find time to find balanced information in the way I'm going to share it. But let's say, for example, Obama's birth certificate. Now, as I understand, I don't know if it's true or not, but Donald Trump started the rumor or is one of the people who pushed the rumor. I don't know who started it, that Obama was not a U.S. citizen, and therefore he was ineligible to be president, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even though the Secretary of State of the state of Hawaii has said, yes, he was legitimately born a U.S. citizen, people, even with that fact, I'll talk about facts and context in a bit, they still don't believe it. Same thing. Many people, as a matter of fact, 70% of people who identify as Republican still believe the 2020 election was rigged and it was not fair, when there's been bipartisan committees, and legitimate government agencies that are even Republican-led that have said there was no impropriety in the 2020 election. Now, you listening right now, notice what happens. If you think the election was rigged, notice what happens. And I'm not saying it was or it wasn't. I'm just giving you examples here. So let's say that you believe, oh my God, it was rigged. And then I say there's no credible evidence that it was rigged. Notice how you automatically refute that. And I'll talk about that in a moment, about why it's so hard to change. So that's all basically the refutation. We refute even facts because it doesn't fit our context. And the context of the last two that I gave you, the bigger frame was proud, patriotic, upstanding Americans, or so they believe and think from that context. Other people can say, well, it's completely irrational. Come on, it's been proven by the Secretary of State of Hawaii that Obama's birth certificate was legitimate, that the 2020 election was not stolen. It's completely irrational to think otherwise. So where I'm going here is whatever side of the aisle you're on, or of any issue in life, it does not matter. And whatever country you live in, because we have listeners all around the world, what we want to look at here is we tend to erroneously believe, interesting belief, we believe that people make rational decisions. That is not always true. Actually, many times our decisions are irrational and ill thought out, and then we base our personal beliefs upon irrational decisions. Then somebody can present somebody with contradictory evidence that what they believe is not true, and they will refute that information. Why? Because their context tells them their belief, simple construct of the mind, tells them it is true. And that is their context. The whole point here is we don't refute, we don't challenge our context, which is our beliefs. So whatever our beliefs are, we tend to literally stay consistent with that belief, even when given contradictory evidence to that belief. Now, the psychological phrase for that is confirmation bias. And what that means is and I ain't judging anybody because I'm sure I've done it or I do it. We refute contradictory evidence, even if it's factual and verifiable. And the reason we don't actually contradict the evidence, or we don't accept the evidence, is because whatever we think we believe, that is our context, and that is the foundation of our reality. I remember many years ago, my NLP trainer, her name is Peggy Dean. She was one of the early teachers. As a matter of fact, Tony Robbins went to her program in the 80s to start learning NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. She was the first person who started teaching, well, one of the first, if not the first person, who started teaching Tony NLP, which he's built his entire career on. And she and I were talking one day. We were business partners for about 20 years. And I said, Peggy, because Peggy's a spiritualist and I'm a spiritualist, we're non-dogmatic in terms of any kind of conventional religion. And I said, Peggy, how come more people don't question their religion? And she said to me, I'm gonna actually add a little more content here. Basically, our religion is our belief system, whatever our religion might be. I mean, our religion can be MTV because religion is actually anything that you believe in strongly. Peggy said to me, which is very profound, people don't actually question their religion because their entire identity is based on that religion. And which is their context. And if they question their religion, they would question their identity, and that makes people uncomfortable because they don't want to question their identity. So ponder that. And I guess what I'm posing to you is how many things are true for you that you just take at face value or you reject immediately. And that's really what I want to, open up there is what things could be true for you that you reject immediately. Now, as I just said, we talked about social things there a little bit, but personal, your beliefs, as I just said, confirm your subconscious identity. We have the identity because I'm going to back up here because I'm going to tell you why, which I've told you before, but we use confirmation bias, okay? And this is a shortcut of the brain. Now, what I mean by that, a shortcut of the brain, is we live in a very complex world. And for many years, but especially the past 50 years, information flies at us at dizzying speeds. I mean, the amount of information we're bombarded with on a daily basis is mind-numbing. So what happens is the brain creates a shortcut with the confirmation bias. Basically, the brain's job is also to conserve energy. So if the brain's got to think about a lot of different things, that's not saving energy. So what the brain does is, boom, shortcuts right to the confirmation bias and says true or not true based upon the identity. And what that means is we either actually will open up to a new belief or we won't, but generally we won't because any new belief is not going to be confirmed by an old identity. Hopefully that made sense to you guys. Now, where I was going, I've said this before. Of the three predominant parts of the brain, the three largest parts of the brain, the oldest part of the brain, called the reptilian part of the brain, actually, that's the name generally used for it, is the oldest reptilian part of the brain, monkey part of the brain. There's a particular function of that part of the brain that operates from predictability. Predictability is a survival mechanism. Now, the reason we have this predictability mechanism is many hundreds of thousands of years ago, if we're going to go hunt for food and we have to leave the cave, we have to have a certain level of predictability about how safe it's going to be to leave the cave. Because if we predict it's not safe to leave the cave, we're not going to leave the cave and hunt for food. So there's a mechanism in the brain that likes predictability. Now, the thing about predictability, change is not predictable, which is one of the reasons it's so hard for us to change, is because change is not predictable. So I want to cut this episode not short, but I want to actually start winding us up and start concretizing this. Two truths I want to share with you. Truth Number one, whether you believe it or not, you can pretty much have anything and everything you want in life. There are certain physical limitations, but not a lot. For example, I'm like going to be 60 years old in about 2 weeks. The probability of me winning the Boston Marathon are very low, extremely low. But the probability, if I wanted to run the Boston Marathon or any marathon, is very high because I know that if I wanted to do it, which I don't want to do it, but if I did, I know that I could do it. So we are limited to some degree by physicalness. I mean, if I have no legs, then it's going to be pretty much impossible for me to win the Boston Marathon. But there's so many, there's so little restrictions. For the most part, I have found, because I had a student one time, 57 years old, who ran 75 consecutive marathons with no preparation, no training, 3 weeks after he had a heart attack, and he ran from Minneapolis to Atlanta, Georgia, 26 plus miles every single day. So don't even begin to tell me what is possible and not possible for people. And this goes back to Napoleon Hill. If the mind can conceive and believe, the mind can achieve. But it's not the analytical thinking, it's the contextual thinking. Whatever the contextual thinking, meaning a subconscious thinking, can think, what you think subconsciously, your context, you absolutely, with like a 99.9% chance, can do it, with the limited exception of what I shared with you, metaphor of the marathon. The two truths are, you pretty much can have anything and everything that you want in life. That's one truth. The second truth is, you don't believe me. And that's true for a lot of people. Because even notice when I said you can have pretty much anything and everything you want, check in with the body. What kind of resistance were you giving me? What kind of resistance were you feeling? That wasn't you consciously. That was your unconscious mind like popping its head out going, no, no, no. That's like me growing up a poor kid in Texas. And many years ago, if you told me that I could be a multimillionaire, I'd have been like, are you kidding me? What are you, smoking crack? There's no way, no how. I can't. I remember back in the year 2000, I had a man that had, as a client of mine, that was a Venezuelan oil billionaire. And he hired me for coaching specifically to teach him subconscious persuasion, influence, and hypnosis. And he said to me one day, I remember this, we were sitting in his office, Rockefeller Center, 30 Rock in New York City. And he said, Jim, I can teach you how to make $1 million a year. This was 26 years ago, by the way. He goes, and by the way, this day and age, if I make $1 million a year, I'm broke. But he said to me, Jim, I can teach you how to make $1 million a year. And I remember scoffing at it, and not in a disrespectful way, but I'm like, yeah, whatever, me, there's no way I can make $1 million a year. I was right. I couldn't make $1 million a year back then. I can now easily, but I couldn't back then because my context operated from, I'm not the kind of person that can make $1 million a year. Now, where I want to go, and this is vital, is many of you, as you're listening, are thinking about, okay, how do I shift my context about health, money, relationships? Meaning, okay, I'm struggling with money. How do I shift my context and believe more that I can have money? Or how do I shift my context and believe that I can have, better health or better relationships or whatever it might be? And I also did that for many years because what I try to do, which is what many of you are trying to do, we try to shift our context about specific behaviors. In particular, we shift our context in 3 primary areas. We try to shift our context about our money, about our health, and about our relationships. But, and here's your big aha in this episode, where I suggest you work from is a higher frame of context. Now, what I mean by that is your context, as I started this episode with, could be that it's very hard to change. So if it's very hard to change, and that is your context, next, when you go to the context, the money, the health, and the relationships, it's hard to change. Why? Because your next level above that context is it's hard to change. So anything you try to change is hard to change. I would suggest a higher context, which is an all-encompassing utilitarian context. And that context would be, are you ready? And it's really simple. It's easy to change. Ponder that. It's easy to change versus what you probably believe, it's hard to change. I'm going to share with you right now, it's not hard to change. The reason it's hard for people to change is because they've been taught to change in a way the brain does not work, and many people work against themselves when they're trying to create change, which means they fail, which then actually reinforces their belief that it's hard to change, and it also reinforces their belief, why should I even try? Because every time I try, I actually fail. Now, I've shared this in many episodes before, but I want to share here. I'm only going to share 3 because I'm going to share one heck of a lot more with you in this secret podcast. I'll talk about that in just a moment. The 3 general ways to change a specific context or a general context is number 1, and I've talked about this since like the first 5 episodes. Number 1, self-hypnosis. Number 2, affirmations. You speak your life into existence. Khalil Gibran once said, is that your words are drippings from the mind. What you speak to yourself, you program yourself with, but what you speak to yourself about comes from your mind, and we've got to use affirmations like Dr. Emile Coué, and you can find that on YouTube, Emilie, I believe, Coue. A French physician, his patients were recovering 5 times faster than patients in nearby clinics through self-talk, which is affirmations. I've also mentioned before the book by Dr. Shad Helmstetter, What to Say When You Talk to Yourself. Learning to talk to yourself. Affirmations are not these hokey things we've seen many years ago, on TV and etc. They really work because they create neural pathways in the brain. But the way to make affirmations even stronger is through imagery, in particular, visual imagery. Well, of course, visual imagery is what imagery is. It's visual, but imagery. And the more we imagine something to be true, the truer it becomes for us. So let me wrap this up. Your transformational takeaway. The question is, why is change so hard? And change is so hard because many of us have an overriding belief that change is hard. So what you want to work on is changing your belief about how easy it is to change. Because your current belief, or changing your belief to how easy it is to change. Because I guarantee you, 99% of you talk to yourself about how hard it is to diet, how hard it is to stop smoking, how hard it is to get up off the couch, how hard it is to break any XYZ habit. And many of you talk about how hard it is, how hard it is, how hard it is. Notice what you're reinforcing. All you're doing is making it a stronger belief that it's hard to change. And I don't know about you guys, I learned that it's hard from my dad. Why? Because watching my dad try to change things, my dad didn't know how to change. And he often fell short, and he taught me through observation that it's hard to change. But the truth is this, even if you don't believe me, the truth is this. It's easy to change when you actually engage and work with your brain in the way that it's designed to operate. I'll say it again. It's easy to change when you engage with your brain in the way it's designed to operate. And those 3 simple ways, and I'm going to give you more in the secret podcast or talk about it more because we're going to start challenging your beliefs in the secret podcast. But 3 ways are self-hypnosis, affirmations, and imagery. Make a mental note of this. It's more powerful to change the belief about your ability to change than it is to change an individual belief. I'll say it again. It's more powerful to change your belief about the ability to change than it is to change an individual belief. About the Secret Podcast, the reason I started that is there are some people who want a lot more and they want to dive even deeper. And I'm just going to be transparent. I'm looking for a way right now, and thank you for bearing with me, to make doing this podcast a win-win deal for both of us, where we both are in eining. It's vital to me. And I've recognized this the last 6 months. It is vital to me that we be in eining. We be in exchange. Because if we're not in exchange and it's lopsided, it's not fair and it's out of balance energetically, and that's not a fit for me. So to listen to the rest of this, and I'm going to actually talk about how to challenge your beliefs, what you want to do, I'm going to give you 22 questions to challenge your beliefs. Self-coaching questions that you can start asking that will automatically start challenging your beliefs. Go to jimfortin.com/insiders, jimfortin.com/insiders. And that, when I say insiders, that's the Be to Have group, and it's called the Be to Have Insiders. And we're going to dig even deeper into this episode. Again, thank you for bearing with me as I find a podcast format that works for us both. I'm balancing bringing you value here in the episodes, but also creating more value over on the Secret Podcast. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you over on another episode. Bye-bye.